please state for the recorder your name, how old you are now, and how old you were in 1998.
My name is Walter G. Diggles, Sr. I am 58 years old now, and if James Byrd Jr.'s death was in 2000, let's see, was that 1998? Okay, then you subtract almost, how many years is that?
13 years?
13 years from where I am now, so that'll be about 40, I guess 13 years from now, it'll be about 48.
Okay, so late 40s at that time?
Yeah.
Okay. Are you from Jasper originally?
I was originally born in Jasper County, and left from high school and attended Dallas Baptist University and spent the next 12 years there in Dallas.
Okay.
And came back to Jasper in 1982.
Okay. What did you do in Dallas, and what brought you back to Jasper?
Well, I graduated from school there in Dallas and married, and my wife and I, after 12 years, decided that my work with Foster Wheeling Energy Corporation was pretty good, but we had some small kids that we were not pleased with some of the public education, and I just decided I wanted to bring them back to the rural area and get a little different educational like I did. So we moved back here in 1982.
And how many children do you have, and how old are they now?
My oldest daughter, Erica, lives in Humble with her husband, and she'll probably get me if I don't give it right, but she's in the late 30s.
Okay.
And they have two girls, and her husband there and all, and that's the oldest. And then the next one is my son. He's right at 34, 35, somewhere around there too. And he lives here in Jasper, works for Lufkin Industries. And then the next one, I have two twin girls.
Wow.
They're fraternal twins, April and Anita. And Anita's here. She runs a little after-school program here at our church. And she's right at 32 or 33. And April and her husband, they live in Lufkin, Texas.
Okay,
and
not that far from here.
She's a biology teacher there.
Okay, is it high school or?
No, she's in I think she's in high school. Biology. I don't know if they do biology for elementary kids, junior high now, but maybe so. I don't know. It's been a long time for me.
Okay.
But and then don't forget the baby.
Okay.
Crystal is my baby, and her and her husband live in Beaumont.
Okay.
And she works for Maximus.
Okay, great. Tell us your title, your occupation, and some of the activities that you're involved in.
I'm the executive director of the Deep East Texas Council of Governments, which is one of the 24 state planning regions in the state of Texas. If you're in Waco, you'd be going to DETCOG. And my job here is to operate this program here, and I've been doing that since 1990 as executive director, and I came to work here in 1982.
Okay.
And I also pastor a church here in Jasper, New Lighthouse Ministries here, where I've been doing that for the last 32 years.
Wow. You've been pastor?
I've been pastor, not here, but I've been pastor.
Somewhere.
Yeah.
32 years. That's a long time.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other activities that you'd like to mention? Any organizations that you're in?
Well, most of the organizations that I'm a part of is I'm a shareholder here in First National Bank in Jasper, on the board, which is a very important position for me here to be in, job creation and small business loans. So I always look at that. And I've just served 6 years as chairman of the One Star National Service Commission, which is a commission in Austin that the Governor Perry appointed me to. Which actually it's a national service organization that helps a lot of volunteers and faith-based organizations to provide public and social services.
Great. Okay, what we're doing today is we're comparing what Jasper was like just before Mr. Byrd was killed to what Jasper is like now. And we're going to look at like economics, race relations, different things. So I'll be asking you various questions about that. Okay, how do you think Jasper has changed since the killing in 1998?
You know, every time I talk to people about race relations and the history of race in America, I have to put it in perspective because of slavery. And our nation has always had I always call it kind of the sin that they never came to grips with, the sin of slavery. And it's always been a evolving process that you've gone through and all. And I read a lot about history and a lot about slavery and what caused it, and how we progressed immediately after slavery and now in the nation. And race is just one of those issues that has always been complicated.
Okay.
And when you look at Jasper, which I always looked at as being a microcosm of America, small towns in the South, mainly because the South was so against slavery, against the abolishment of slavery, and they were so against it that they went to war, and the Civil War was the worst catastrophic event in our history, and it also took more lives of American citizens than any war in history. But when you think about Jasper before Byrd, James Byrd Jr., we had a very progressive, little small community, an African-American mayor. You know, we had Chamber of Commerce, who was a dentist here, Dr. Coleman. We had a lot of blacks in positions in the school board and activities, and there were a lot of things in Jasper that showed that it was a progressive, small, rural community in East Texas. And since I worked with 12 counties and 38 cities in East Texas, I'm very familiar with the makeup of the government bodies. And Jasper had a very progressive record of not only electing a black mayor and defeating 2 whites, but it appeared to be a little ahead of some of the other communities in East Texas with accepting the leadership of an African-American mayor. That didn't mean that the whole community was free of bias and its problems with racism. And so when the James Byrd murders occurred in Jasper, the white community really made a very a strong effort to make sure that the community didn't believe that this was really what the community was about. So they aggressively pursued the prosecution of these 3 men who were charged with a crime. And in the end, just like they promised the black community, they 2 got the death penalty and 1 got life without parole. So we were very pleased with the outcome of those trials. Some were all white juries, and of course some were mixed juries, but in the end they all came out with the same verdict. The Byrd family, the community was very, very involved and participated in that process. I think the news media was very, very aggressive in trying to examine this community from the standpoint of historical racism, and they were able to I think, get a pretty good picture of a community who pulled together during the time of a very severe crisis. So now we're still in 2011 still dealing with the race issue in America. And Jasper again is a microcosm of what's going on in America today, with the changing population of Hispanic and African Americans and minorities, and the disconnect there with the issue of race. So I've been a student of history for a long time, and I've talked to people who are white, Jewish, of all walks of life about race. And the question becomes more complicated because when you really get deep into it, the races are so mixed now, and it's hard to determine who's white or who's black or who's what. And
more mixed babies born today than other race.
And they're majority in the nation now, those the kids. So you got those challenges there, but when it comes down to economics, it's a lot different with the distribution of wealth in America. The wealth process and the educational process has not been equal yet.
Okay, state some of those differences and how they look in Jasper.
And in Jasper, you can see the exact same thing because most of the businesses are owned by whites.
Okay.
Very few minority businesses other than the funeral home, a few eating institutions and things that are there. But other than that, the major businesses are owned by whites, and therefore the economy is pretty much the same as it was before James Byrd as it is now.
Okay.
And I think that's perhaps the biggest, what I call, inequality with businesses and industry and wealth that we see in Jasper and a lot like some of the other areas of the country.
Well, do you think that there was a lull after the murder and now things have gotten better, or do you think it's been the same? There was no impact. Like, did industry leave the city, or were there people considering coming to Jasper, like companies, but
Well, the image was certainly affected by the Byrd murder. That affected the image Jasper had in the minds of people because of the gruesome and the way the murder occurred. And it affected, I think, a lot of people's feelings about coming to visit the town or tourism and those kind of things. So yeah, we saw a downtick in that area just because people said, well, no, I don't think I want to come to that town because that's where they drag the black men. And so we experienced that. There were some attempts to work on it, but overall, if you think about what the aggressive way that whites approached the Byrd murder and trying to resolve a crime, they were aggressive because they realized what the cost would be if they didn't do it. So this really forced them to really push back against that charge of racism in a way that before they may have not done because they didn't have a reason to do it. So we saw that during the Byrd trials and immediately after following that, because there were a lot of town hall meetings and planning about people coming together.
Did you play a role in planning those meetings?
Well, yeah, typically my role has always been a planner,
kind of behind the scenes,
convener, and if you ever take a look at the Jasper movie, Jasper, Texas Showtime movie, which that we were partly my diary that I did doing the Byrd murder.
Oh, okay.
They took that and used it as part of the script.
I'll have to
sign a
check
release
that
with
out. There are about three movies. I've seen one of them, but I don't think I saw the Showtime.
Yeah. Showtime was about the first one. They've got a lot of documentaries out now about one town. I was featured in the one with the New York University, the student that did that one here on site. And then recently there was a documentary by a guy in Beaumont that did one recently.
Okay, great. And do you think that they really did a good job of reflecting what was going on at that time?
Well, Showtime was pretty entertaining.
Okay.
That was basically,
sensational.
Yeah, they were.
That's what you expect.
Yeah, from them. And they had quite a bit of entertaining items to it. But the documentaries were pretty much true to life. I think they were trying to reflect people as they were, who they were, and it was a lot more realistic.
They didn't have as many stereotypes. Yeah.
No.
Okay. So this brings us to my next question. Why do you think James Byrd Jr. was killed? Do you think it was because of some of the positive things that were going on in the African-American community at that time, or do you think that had no impact on it?
Yeah, I think that you had some ex-convicts who had been released from prison who were associated with gangs in prison and came out with some real strong anti-blacks, minorities, Jews. They just had those beliefs in prison. And they came out and one night, that one of them who was kind of the leader, King, he was just an evil person. And he saw an opportunity to do something that was very gruesome and some part of some initiation, and because of his evil nature, he led those other two guys to commit this crime. And they wanted to make a statement, and they made a statement, not only to those white supremacists and other gang members out there, but they were trying to show that they were able to do something that would shake the very, soul of the nation.
And maybe get away with it.
Yeah, and maybe get away with it because of where they did it at. So, that was, to me, the most revealing thing about the murder was that there is evil, and it is real. And people, to do something like that, you'd have to be evil. And there was good and evil. And racism, yes, it was a part of it, but these guys were evil. And the way they took the man's life, even though that he was helpless, to chain him behind a truck with a chain and to drag him down I'm talking about a paved road until he hit a culvert and just cut him in two, and then leave the head body on the side of the road in front of people's homes. So you can imagine the image that people here had in their minds about something happening this close. So, and when the media made their presence known, said, hey, what's going on in this town when somebody would do a human being worse than an animal? So that's why I think that Jasper and America still wrestles with not only the slave issue and the inequality of humans based on pigmentation of skin, you know, you got a nation that has a capitalistic society where Michael Jackson and other very wealthy African Americans, you know, sometimes they get exempted until something comes up where they're involved in the justice system. So O.J. Simpsons and others and all, so you see all those kind of things that the nation faces. But here in Jasper, we're still wrangling with that same issue of race, because it's an issue that is very difficult to not only talk about within the races. It's an issue that goes from individual to individual. So we're definitely have made some progress, because the council is 4 blacks, a white mayor, and 1 white council member here now. But it still doesn't mean that there's not racial issues and problems, because there are. But if you go down the street to Beaumont, if you go to Austin, if you go to Waco, you know, you got racial issues because of the Tea Party and people who just believe that their way is the right way, and they don't have any tolerance for people who are different. And so I think the Byrd murder is something that you know, takes a lot of people to take a look closely at, because you could see that whites were not going to sit back and see themselves being painted as being in agreement with what happened to Mr. Byrd. So they became real aggressive to make sure that justice was served. But I think the big question for me in my position here is economic equality and education, which to me helps people transcend the race issue, because the lack of education is what blacks were not afforded immediately after slavery. They were separate and unequal. And now we're still catching up, but we had a long way to come from.
So you mentioned education. What are some of the other areas that you think blacks still need to catch up in Jasper?
I still believe that the economic conditions of blacks and the lack of emphasis on crime and drugs in our communities. Drugs have played a very detrimental role in a lot of young people's lives. The criminal justice system reflects those numbers very, very glaringly. And until you know, we can really deal with that drug issue that seems to motivate our young people to get involved in that trafficking, because they can get quick money. And it's very evident here. Mr. Byrd was a man who had some problem with the criminal justice system, and even drugs and alcohol had been a part of his life. And so he was not able to have transportation, so he was hitchhiking that night. And these guys gave him a ride in the back of their pickup truck. So it's likely and possible that if he had a job and had not been involved in that kind of trafficking things, that maybe he would have had a transportation to go back and forth.
In the wrong place at the wrong time.
Absolutely.
Do you have something you'd like to add?
Yes, Mr. Diggles. You know, Jasper, prior to that murder, Visitor Glass, Louisiana Pacific, and I want to say Timberland, they were pretty productive and had a high rate of, there were, you know, quite a few individuals who worked there from a population standpoint, or working standpoint. How do you feel that decrease, and also the closing of Visitor and the cutback at LP affected Jasper's?
You know, a lot of those economic setbacks in Jasper after the Byrd tragedy were kind of things that were already in the making. Temple Inland were diversifying their company and moving to Austin. their major headquarters and getting more involved in banking and some of the other industries that were not so dependent on timber. And I think overall, the 2010 census that just came out reflected the growth of more retirees. More people who were moving from Houston and Dallas to Lake San Raymond and Jasper because they wanted to retire near the water and near a place to play golf and fish. So we see those seniors coming in, but we don't see the job mainly because a lot of the young people were moving. They didn't want to stay in Jasper. And I think that some of them, even now, places like Byrd, places that are known for long histories of racism, they've all seen a population drop in young people. But the older people, some of the seniors, they retire in those communities. But yeah, there's been a lot of job loss in the rural areas in East Texas. I think if you go to Nacogdoches, where I've got an office there, and one in Lufkin and one in Livingston, if you locate along 59, you see some growth there. The highest growth of the population is down 59. I guess it's San Jacinto County, Polk County, and then coming to Angelina and Nacogdoches County. Those are some growth areas. But here on 190 and 96, they're just not as much growth as been there in the last 10 years.
Okay, so you mentioned media coverage earlier. What did you think of the media coverage? Did you think it was fair or biased?
Well, the media coverage came in, and a lot of times they already had their idea about what Jasper was. They had already painted Jasper being a racist town because of the murder. Jasper was by no means perfect, but in comparison with other communities, they had made a lot of progress in some areas. So the media, when they came in to really put that microscope on Jasper to see exactly what was there, and that's exactly what they did. What they saw was a community that had made some progress. They could understand why the black guy was a mayor. Hey, this town's not black. And then they went to the hospital, and the administrator was a black guy. And then they went to the chamber, and it had a black dentist who was president of the one chamber, not two chambers of commerce. And they went to the school board, and they saw Herman Wright, which is a black guy who was a retired colonel in the Army, and he was president of the school board. And so they saw a lot of leadership that they didn't expect to see in this town. So it was very, very strategic for Jasper to have all that in place because they didn't have to manufacture it. But now the people who lived here, like myself, while those things were true, it went back to the economic disparities that we knew were still there. Because you had a few professionals in place that were doing things in some of these high-profile jobs and chambers, but at the same time you didn't have the number of private sector business owners that had got loans from banks to get it done. So the media, after they've stayed here for a long time and saw the first trial, saw the reaction of the Byrd family, saw that they were not calling for, any kind of really, boycotts or any kind of civil unrest. They saw how they were just graceful people, and they wanted to see the process go through. And when all the KKK and the Black Panthers and the skinheads and all those people came in, the Byrd family didn't allow them to come in and say, look, this is what you need to do. Instead, they listened to the district attorney and listened to some of us in the community and said, we're going to go through this process.
That's good.
And
So they weren't able to frame it the way they thought they were going to be able to.
That's exactly right. And they ended up coming out with a pretty, I think, clear picture of the community because they stayed here for all three trials.
Okay, so at that time, the mayor was black. What was the makeup of the city council?
It was a majority white council.
Okay, so you had a black mayor. What about the school board at that time?
The school board was probably 3 on the school board then, but it was a majority white council. So majority school board, white, majority city council, no blacks on the commissioner's court in the county. So like I said, they had some leadership there that reflected that it was not all just a white majority community.
Mr. Armstrong is here for his 4 o'clock appointment.
Okay. he can wait.
Okay.
We'll be all right.
We just have a few more questions. So how does that compare to now? You said you have a majority now. So
We have a majority city council.
And one member and the mayor are white, and then what about the school board?
School board has 3 blacks on there now,
3 blacks and how many whites?
and they have 4 whites.
4 whites, but you still don't have any Hispanics in office or any others?
The Hispanic population has been very, very slow to get involved in the public, what I call political process. You know, the population is,
It has grown,
it has just, it's exploded here, you know, but you just haven't got a lot of activity in participation, and that's why I think you see all these sanctuary city bills, these voter ID bills come up, because they're afraid that one day they're going to wake up and say, yeah, I can vote. And so when they wake up and decide that, hey, that, you know, meantime I can vote you out and make a change.
Yeah.
And they're hoping that won't happen.
Okay. Kind of skip through here. We're almost done. What do you think the long-lasting effects will be of the James Byrd murder?
You know, I really think that the lasting, probably the legacy of James Byrd Jr. Will be on our community. Would be a time when there was a very, very sad day in our history that occurred. It was a tragic incident that happened to Mr. Byrd. But I think history will look back and say, you know, those people came together, convicted those 3 guys. One of them is scheduled to die this year, and then the other one is sitting back there waiting, and the other one got life. And the Byrd family created the Byrd Foundation for Racial Healing, and the foundation is going forward, doing things in the community, talking about cultural awareness and cultural sensitivities and all, and cultural competencies, and they're doing some good things. And I think they'll look at it and see that for those people who were here, who came to Jasper during that time, and who stood at the courthouse square and watched the Ku Klux Klan march down the town with their hoods on and spewing out their hate and talking about the non-majority races in such a public way that was pretty hard to swallow. But to still see those white people come up behind them and condemn them, and they say, we do not believe that in these messages. You know, we saw that happen, and we saw that Black Panthers come in town with their guns, and we saw them march down the streets with the Klan and the Black Panthers, and they were inciting violence and civil unrest, and it was one of those close calls where you could have had civil unrest like the 60s.
But it didn't happen.
It didn't happen. And that, to me, is going to be the legacy of Jasper because of what the justice system did. The district attorney, the sheriff, you just had people who were working hard together on the local level and the federal level and the state level that I think caused it. The FBI played a tremendous role in just being very present and calming and making sure that they were not going to let anything go, you know, bad with this particular case.
Okay. Do you have another question you'd like to ask?
Oh, sure.
Okay. How do you see the future of Jasper?
You know, Jasper, like Texas and the South, they've got some steep hurdles, I think, to climb because of the current climate in society that tends to exclude people based on their economic status or whether they're immigrant or whether they're somebody who's different. And they're getting more exclusive in it with bills in Austin and Washington that talk about sanctuary cities and voter ID. It goes back to some of the Jim Crow laws. So I think there's a danger of minorities being taken for granted. And Jasper's like that now because we're in the middle, politically here, we're in the middle of just kind of that rise and that a little bit, people being a little bit bold to say things that, you know, 10, 15 years ago they wouldn't say politically. And you see that now because the media has changed a little bit with the people got their own media, you know, Fox News has got their own brand, and you got the internet, and you got Facebook and Twitter, and people are just communicating at lightning speed, and they're saying just about anything and everything that they want to say.
Right.